Hey guys, so today we're going to be looking at ecology, and really we're going to cover the vocabulary associated with ecology. Um, as we go through this unit, we'll dig deeper into each of these concepts. This is just a quick overview to get you comfortable with that vocabulary. If you have any questions, you can always ask during our class sessions. And you can always stop me and rewind if you need to see something again. So we're going to get started. So ecology is just the study of organisms in their environment. An organism is a single living thing. So you are an organism, a tree is an organism, my cat is an organism. A population is a group of organisms of the same species living in the same area. So a whole bunch of cats or a whole bunch of people living in a particular area would be considered a population. A community is going to be all of the living things in an area that interact with each other. And so that's going to have more things involved. So it would be the plant, the cat, the bug, the person, all of those populations that interact with each other in a particular area. An ecosystem includes the community, but it also includes the non-living things. So there we start thinking about the temperature, the water, climate starts to come into ecosystems. And then all together, if we look at the whole thing, that's what we call the biosphere. Biotic versus abiotic. So this is just vocabulary. Biotic, bio just means living things, and abiotic is non-living. So a biotic factor would be something that's alive or was once alive. Another term that is associated with that is organic. It's just something that's living that can influence the environment. Abiotic factors are non-living factors. Now these still influence what kind of ecosystem you're going to have and can have a huge impact. However, they're not alive. So this is going to be light, water, wind, fire, temperature, how much precipitation or rainfall you get in a certain area. And this can be really important in determining the type of living factors that can exist somewhere. All right, so here you're going to get all of that vocabulary I was talking about before. So a species, these are individuals that can breed with one another and produce viable offspring. So I always think about that as they can make babies that can have babies of their own. Population are all of the individuals of the same species in a particular area. So if we're talking about ducks in this case, all of the ducks of the same species that can interbreed. So again, a population, these are organisms that can breed with each other. They're considered the same species. And species is pretty straightforward, but there's some gray area there. We'll talk about that later. Community is all the populations that live together in a particular area. So if we're on our duck example, you have the duck, you have the fish, you have the muskrat, you have the crawfish, or crayfish. All of those living things within that area are going to be part of the community. So look around you for a second and try to identify some living things that are in your area. So if I think about me, I've got some plants in my office. My cat comes to visit every once in a while. Me, I'm sure there's some bacteria. All of those would be part of my community. If I look out my window, I can see other plants, some birds. That's just the living things that interact with each other. Again, an ecosystem is going to be that community plus the physical or abiotic factors in the area. Again, pause for a second and think about what other factors would be included in your ecosystem. Biome is a large area that has a particular climate and species of plants and animals that live there. So the tundra is an example. Desert, deciduous forest, grasslands. So those are kind of big overarching descriptions of the types of ecosystems. And having that generalized term allows us to make predictions about the organisms that live in an area. So when you think of a desert, you have kind of an idea of what the climate is like there and the type of organisms that'll be found there. So this is useful for generalization. And again, biosphere is the entire part of the earth that supports life. So that was a lot of vocabulary. Let's see if you can apply that vocabulary. So you probably want to pause here and see if you can fill in the blanks. So a group of animals that can live in the same area and can interbreed would be called a species. The study of organisms and their interactions within the environment is known as ecology. A large area that has a particular climate and distinct plants and animals is called a biome. All of the different populations living in an area, so plants, rabbits, coyotes, is called the community. An ecosystem includes all the living and non-living factors. So that would be biotic and abiotic. You could have put either one. The portion of the planet that can sustain life is the biosphere, and animals that can interbreed are called a species. For 1 and 7, you could say species, but you could also say population. Those are kind of, they both would apply there. All right, so now we're going to look at some of the vocabulary associated with energy flow. When we study ecosystems, a lot of what we're looking at is how does matter and how does energy flow within that ecosystem, and how can we maintain kind of healthy movement. So usually we will categorize organisms as either autotrophs or heterotrophs. So an autotroph, also known as a producer, can make its own food. Not like go to the grocery store and buy some food and then cook it on the stove, but like go out in the sun and turn inorganic sunlight into sugar. So these producers, these are going to be your plants. There are certain bacteria that can also do this. They're going to be able to turn inorganic, just energy, into food or organic compounds like sugars. Heterotrophs, or consumers, have to eat something else in order to get their energy. And we can break those down into categories. You have herbivores. Those are going to eat plants. Carnivores are going to eat meat or other heterotrophs. Omnivores are going to eat both plants and animals. And then detritivores or decomposers, those are going to help break down dead organic matter. So your fungus falls into that, bacteria falls into that. All right, some other interactions and vocabulary we're going to use. You have mutualism. And again, we're going to talk about this in more detail later on, but mutualism is a symbiotic relationship. So this is a close interaction between two organisms where both are going to benefit. Commensalism is where one benefits and one isn't affected at all. Parasitism, so a parasite, that's where one benefits and one is harmed. And then another term that comes up sometimes is mimicry, where one like pretends to be something else. So we usually talk about energy flowing through ecosystems. So it starts at the sun. The sun gets converted into sugars through producers. Those are your plants. So the energy starts at the sun. Producers take that energy, convert it into food. That energy flows from them to the thing that eats them. We call those primary consumers. And then when the primary consumers get eaten by another organism, the secondary consumers, some of their energy is going to be passed on. So notice that the arrows are going from the thing that gets eaten to the thing that's doing the eating. You'll also notice that there's some loss of energy over here. And so oftentimes this isn't 100% efficient process. So the energy is going to be released out into the world. You're not going to have 100% conversion from one to the other. So here we're going to look at this in a little bit more detail. These food chains kind of follow the flow of energy in your trophic levels. So trophic are just feeding levels. Again, we'll dig deeper into all of this, but having the vocabulary sometimes makes it easier to have a conversation. So trophic levels are just feeding relationships. Where do you fall on that? All of the energy, again, starts from the sun. It's captured by plants. So they're going to be the first level of all food chains. So we say that the plants are your producers. That's the first level, level 1. And you usually only go up 4 or 5 levels, again, because you have that loss of energy every time there's a transition from one level to the next. It's inefficient. And then all things end with decomposers, because eventually we all die and they recycle. So here at our first level, you have the producer, some sort of autotroph. Then the thing that eats the producer is called a primary consumer. That's generally going to be your herbivore. Then you have a secondary consumer, which is your carnivore. And tertiary, so third level consumer here, is another example of a carnivore. And eventually it all goes down to the decomposers. So again, your producer could also be called an autotroph, and all of those consumers can also be called heterotrophs. Sunlight's going to be the main source of energy, and the process that we use to convert is going to be photosynthesis. That's not the only way that food can get made. There's also something called chemosynthesis. And this is actually really cool. This is, or at least I think it's really cool because I'm a bio nerd. But there are bacteria that can change inorganic compounds into organic compounds, similar to photosynthesis. We call it chemosynthesis. We actually discovered these when we went down to the hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean. So we had never been able to get that deep in the ocean. We got down there. We weren't expecting to find anything alive because no sunlight can get down there. And there was this whole amazing ecosystem. And the basis of that ecosystem, the bottom of that food chain, was actually these bacteria that can make energy using the chemicals that were coming out of these hydrothermal vents. So super, super cool. If you're ever bored, just look up hydrothermal vents and the bacteria. So the food chains, we look at those because it shows us the relationship between organisms, and then we can make some predictions about what's going on if there's an issue in that ecosystem and we're trying to follow the energy. But in reality, you know, the mouse doesn't just eat that one plant, usually. And the snake doesn't just eat that mouse. It usually is a little bit more complicated. And so a food chain is a simple flow of energy from one to the other. Notice where the arrows are pointing. A food web is going to be a combination of all of those things. So it's a bunch of food chains put together. So here you see an example of a food web. This is a better representation of what's actually going on because nature is complicated sometimes. So here you can see all of those things coming together. So a food web is just a bunch of food chains and all of the relationships that come together. Here's a simplified version of a food web. Again, pause and see if you can identify primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers. And then I want you to see if you can find the omnivore, the one that's eating both plants and animals. So, if you've gone through, you should be able to identify an example of a primary consumer would be the grasshopper or the squirrel or the rabbit. Secondary would be your frog, your fox. Tertiary, if you look at the owl and you go from the grasshopper to the frog, so this is primary, secondary, tertiary. Primary, secondary, I guess that just goes to secondary. Here you can do primary, secondary, tertiary. So sometimes it depends which line you follow. And then the omnivore, hopefully you're able to figure it out, would be your mouse here, right? Because it's eating the plant, that would make it a primary consumer. But it also eats the grasshopper, which makes it a secondary consumer. And so it would be considered an omnivore because it's doing both. All right, we're almost done. Another way at looking at energy flow in an ecosystem is by looking at these ecological pyramids. And an energy pyramid is just another way of visualizing what's going on. Remember I said that energy transfer was not 100% efficient? Well, here you're going from producers to consumers, and we say that only about 10% of the energy is going to be transferred from one level to the next. And so here you can see if 100% is at the producer level, about 10% of the energy that was available at the producer level actually gets transferred to the next level. And then only about 10% of that goes to the level after that, and so on. Much of that energy is actually lost as heat, or it just gets used by the organisms at that level. And so a pyramid is a good visualization of how that energy is being transferred. We also have pyramids that look at things like biomass or number of individuals. So there are different ways of measuring what's present in a particular ecosystem. So I hope that was useful for you guys. There's a ton of vocabulary, but once we have all the vocabulary down, then we can really just dig into the topics. If you have any questions, remember you can always ask. Take care. Bye.